This is the Cliff Yates Show. Personal growth, motivation, inspiration, and philosophies for a great life.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Cliff Yates Show. I'm so glad to have you here with us today. As always, I have a great guest that I'm retired LA Sergeant Cliff Yates, and today I have retired Chief Pat Jordan, retired from the LA County Sheriff's Department. I call us friends, but we also work together. I worked under him, worked with him, and we've since reconnected with our podcast platforms. And today we're talking about police suicides. And before we get into it, I want to introduce Pat, bring him on. He's now continued a life of service by hosting a couple different podcasts and also serving with the LA Mission. I'll let him tell you a little about what he's doing before we get into the subject matter. Pat, welcome to the show.
Hey, Cliff, thank you for having me on your show yet again. And again, thank you for co-hosting or guest hosting some of my podcasts when I was out of town. But yeah, you can catch me on every Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I do a program on YouTube and Rumble called Pop Culture Minefield Morning Coffee with the Chief, where we go over a cop-related movie or a crime-related movie. And my next movie coming up is going to be Death Wish.
Oh, that's
Charles
great.
Bronson, so
yeah.
1974. And God, there's so many great actors in that movie. I was going through it. I go, holy smoke. I mean, Jeff Goldblum's in there as one of the punks, right?
Yes.
And then on Wednesdays, I do a much more serious podcast. Wednesday nights, it's 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, but it's 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's on kgradb.com. So it's on a broadcasting platform. We broadcast over Rumble, the podcast portion, and it stays on Rumble for about 5 days, and then it goes behind the paywall for kgradb.com. But you know, they like the show so much, they see them as a public service, these law enforcement shows, and they have a few of them. My show is Briefing with the Chief, like I said, every Wednesday, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But if you go to the kgradb.com website, and then you hit the shows and host tab, you'll see my show Briefing with the Chief on Wednesdays. And when you hit that, when you click on that, you'll see my show bio, my show description page, my bio, and at the bottom are all the audio versions of my show, which is really cool because I know we're going to talk about police suicides, but my original show, my very first show, was police suicides. And then you can also catch me on Twitter at LASDJordan, and I am not restrained on what I comment on Twitter. And fair warning, I'm Republican. I lean right. I'm conservative on some issues. I'm moderate on others. And I get leftists on there occasionally, and they get triggered. I get the all cops are bastard crowds, and they get triggered. But that's why God put me on this earth, to trigger those crazy people, right? And I also sit on the board of the LA Mission, which services the homeless in downtown Los Angeles. You can go to the lamission.org, losangelesmission.org. And, you know, if you have a little bit extra money, make a donation. They help a lot of people who are in need. And that's what I'm doing with myself these days.
Yeah, I'm going to include all of your links in the YouTube description on the YouTube channel. And also I'll put it in the show notes on all of the podcast platforms the show is also on. So we're all over the place. And, wow, you're doing a lot of great stuff. But I'll have all those links available to anybody who wants to go check that out. And especially, I will recommend all my police brothers and sisters to check out the Morning Coffee with the Chief, because those movies that you review, and I've been honored to be a guest on some of those shows, it's just a lot of fun to go over those old movies again and from a police perspective. And I loved your show on police suicides, and the reason I just wanted to touch on that again is because obviously, I consider, after listening to your show, you a subject matter expert really on it, and recently touched really a lot of us, specifically in the LA Sheriff's Department, because we went in a 24-hour period. We had 4 suicides. It kind of made the CNN news, and it made national news and USA Today, and it hit home with me specifically because one of those people that committed suicide was I would consider him a good friend of my wife's and me, who was a commander on the Sheriff's Department, someone I served with in the Deputy Leadership Institute, and then we went on to be promoted into the Supervisory Leadership, SLI, of the Sheriff's Department. And he worked closely with my wife, someone who And maybe in all these cases, I'll let you talk about. Then it's just someone I never would have picked that could have happened to. To me, it was just such a stable individual, someone who was well grounded, who was a family man, who just in a positive outlook on life. As much as I remember, I've been retired over 10 years. So, when this 24-hour period hit, I had 3 members of the department that I knew pretty well. I'm looking at their names now. They committed suicide, and the latest one was the commander. And so I don't know, have you had personal members that touched you in this way, Pat?
Well, I knew the commander. Obviously getting the executive ranks, you tend to know each other, and he was in a critical position, so he interacted with a lot of us who are senior to him. And it surprised me. And the other thing that surprised me is not only did we have 3 more in a 24-hour period, but we had 1 more later in the month, and we had a total of 9 at that point on the LA County Sheriff's Department for 2023, which is highly unusual.
Yeah.
You're talking maybe 1 or 2, and we were already up to 9, which is why I chose to do that as my first show. I was going to try and get a political guest on and talk about fentanyl, but this one just burst onto the scenes. You had to do it. It made national news.
Yeah.
And it was very personal. And the thing about police suicide and the suffering of police, that it's not something that hits the paper. It's not something that hits the news. I mean, people have to die before the news actually covers it, but it's a very important part of public policy. And that the show that I do, Briefing with the Chief, is about the news, public policy, and politics. And so it kind of hit all those buttons, so I had to do it, and it was very personal.
Before we go too far with it, because I think maybe it's the military, right? They have 988, or where can people call? Like, where do the police call? I know we have peer support services for the LA Sheriff's Department, but is there like a national hotline for? I know there's a group called Help. There's a Help the Blue or something that.
There's the 1-800-COP, and let me.
That's right, 1-800-COP.
All right, there's COP line, and it's COP line. It's 1-800-267-5463, and that's for law enforcement. But we should talk about other first responders. There's one for fire and medics as well, and that's 1-800-731-FIRE, and that's 3473. And it's we talked mostly about. Well, we talked about law enforcement, but anybody that's a first responder is having the challenge. And I think when I did that show, I really was. I mean, I had a good awareness of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress injuries, right?
I know, yeah.
And I understood that they do impact people in a negative way, and that suicides can be a byproduct of post-traumatic stress injuries. I just didn't understand the breadth, and I didn't understand all the other factors that go into police suicide. And I think if where there's a lot of things that I came away with that episode, but the number one thing that I came away with is, if you have been a career law enforcement officer, then you have suffered post-traumatic stress injuries, period. That should be presumptive. Policymakers fight that because they don't want to acknowledge that police officers might be injured, because then that might cost them money, right? So
right.
Our politicians and that kind of thing. But if you've worked in law enforcement and a firefighter or any amount of time, you likely have chronic post-traumatic stress injuries. And that's probably the biggest takeaway that I came from doing that show. And the other thing is very personal for a lot of police officers, because as I did the show, I recalled the situations I was in. I recalled the emotions I go through when certain things happen, because post-traumatic stress injuries, when something familiar happens, many times it can trigger you remembering those events.
Absolutely. We have there's an association, or we're anchored because to either a sound, feel, or touch from that memory. I don't know if you must probably know anchoring, right? If you're at a funeral and you're in that sad emotion and people keep patting you on the back, hey, sorry, you're feeling that emotion, people patting you on the back. 10 years later, someone can pat you on the back in that same exact way, and you don't even know why you're depressed. So, like you're saying, you can be anchored to something.
Well, there's two things that immediately will trigger me now. I mean, recently, I noticed one now recently. I was asked to comment on the shooting in Tennessee where that transgendered
Yeah,
person killed the kids, right?
right,
And so the cops were wearing body worn cameras.
right. I saw that footage.
Saw that, and so
Yeah,
I had commented immediately after the shooting that day, and then I was asked to look at the footage and then come back on the next day. It was on another platform. It was TNT Radio, and I do expert commentary for them. And I started watching the body cam footage, and my adrenaline shot up, my emotion shot
yeah,
up. It was like I was right there, and I had been right there 100 times during my career,
right.
and all those feelings came back, and I was sitting on my couch watching it. I had projected it on TV, watching it on TV, and I'm going through all these emotions.
Yeah, and I can kind of see why that this would become more real. First, because you have all the modalities you're experiencing this from, right? You're seeing it and you're hearing it, but also now you're not looking at it from a disassociated outside view. From the body camera, now it's your eye view, right? The point of view, which makes the reality of it more real. I mean,
Yes, and but also one that just connects things to an
well, because
event
of your
that
memory. Yeah,
yeah, your
yeah,
memory. Well, we've been there, right? Where you're chasing somebody down an
right.
alley with a gun, and you're going to a shooting. Everybody else is going the other direction. You're going into the shooting. We've all been there, and so those emotions, that anxiety, that fear, all pops up when you watch that. But also, the trauma of events that happen. And one of the things I recognized is bagpipes.
Oh my God,
So
yeah,
ever since when I was a little kid, my dad is retired 37 years
yeah,
from Detroit police, and we used to go to memorial services for police officers, and the bagpipers there. Windsor would come over because we're right next to Canada, and their bagpipers would come over, and so I always associated bagpipes to the death of a police officer. And when I was doing a movie, The Onion Field, that was one of the first movies I did.
yeah,
And in that movie, the biggest subject in that movie is post traumatic stress disorder by the survivor Hedinger.
right,
And a big part of the theme in the movie, and it was a great writer, Joseph Wambaugh, who wrote
yeah,
wrote about this, The Onion Field, the true story of the Onion Field, and then they made it into a movie, and he had great creative control to make sure it stayed close to the story, right?
right.
But bagpiping was a big part of it, and that just reminded me of all those memorial services I went to as a kid, and all those memorial services that I went to during my 38-year career.
Yeah,
Death, sadness, and you feel that anxiety and that depression when it comes on. It's not one of it's not one of joy and happiness. It's one of despair and
yeah,
hopelessness.
it is. Yeah, and I kind of, later in my career, I felt a little bit. That was so, God, that I stopped going to the funerals. I kind of felt guilty about it because, man, I really took me into such a bad place. I mean, it's nice. You're seeing the people from all over the country come together at these funerals, but man, it just, specifically when you know them personally, just was kind of tough on me. Yeah, I don't know, and of course on all of us, but I stopped going to them in the last 5 or 6 years of my career.
Well, it's hard, and I think the last memorial service I went to was for Ryan Klinkenbloomer. So his dad,
Oh
Mike.
wow, recently then.
Yeah, I didn't go to the funeral because I was heading out to
Yeah,
Europe, but they had a memorial service. They held a gathering for him the day before I left town, and it was like 4 days before the funeral. And so I went to see him there, and I realized, if I know somebody, then my goal should be to go to support them. And
yeah,
I'm glad I went because Mike was very happy I was there. His wife was very happy I was there. I
yeah,
had a personal relationship with them, and so it was important for me to go. And surprisingly, a lot of people recognized me as the chief, and they
yeah,
were
yeah,
happy that the retired chief came. So
yeah,
I was happy I went, and I hope to connect with Mike soon to take him to lunch and go over it. But it does bring back all the memories. But I think the point is post-traumatic stress should be a presumptive injury
Right.
for law enforcement in my mind, just like stress-related high blood pressure is, just like heart disease related to stress-related high blood pressure is. I know these personally, so and because they're all manifestations of post-traumatic stress
Correct. Yeah.
injury, right? So we ought to
Yeah.
just say it. If you've spent this much time in law enforcement, it is likely that you suffer from some level of post-traumatic stress injury.
Let me talk about something you guys addressed this on your show, and so it was with Cece Woods. Is that who it is?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So because when I was a cop in upstate New York in the '70s, uh, the sheriff even back then he brought the families together. He wanted more communication between husband and wives who their spouses who are non-law enforcement to try to create less domestic problems and depression. And even though in the 5 years I was back there, I don't even remember. We never had a suicide. Can you imagine going 5 years? We never had a suicide. And I noticed the department, LA Sheriff's Department specifically in earlier years in the 80s, were very prominent in promoting outside interest. And so sometimes I would think I should be focused more on my job because I am on a bowling league and here I am doing comedy. But in the end, it probably was the best for my mental health. And it was going along with getting involved in cultures outside the police culture. And now, as you guys kind of were addressing, I don't know, I'm sure the department still has a intention of that, but maybe by lack of resources and personnel, they have kind of thrown that aside, it appears. I mean, they're just drafting people and they're just making them constantly work in a forced manner. The job is already stressful if you just did 40 hours. Now you're doing 60, 70 a week. Kind of address your feelings on that.
Well, actually, there's a couple of things. I think we touched on the what is seen as a lack of prioritizing the mental health of the staff.
Right.
If we have a presumption that there's post-traumatic stress injury, then we ought to have a presumption that there should be treatment, right? There ought to be ongoing treatment to keep people safe. Now, one of the interesting findings as I did my research about suicides, cop suicides, and depression, is a lack of sleep is a critical factor in people developing depression and handling it in an unhealthy way.
Yeah, I just did an episode on my podcast about sleep and what it causes in the body and how to promote better sleep. Because I was out, and we should be in the circadian rhythm, right, of the sun coming up and the sun going down, and we can't as law enforcement. However, I tried to artificially create that in my environments when I work nights. And then the importance, if you're getting a lack of sleep, how that actually puts cortisol in your system, the stress hormone is produced, and your body is not able as well to metabolize fat, and all sorts of bad things happen when you don't get sleep, as you were alluding to.
Yeah, and so on. Let's clarify, because on the show I clarified too. There are a lot of jobs where they're very demanding in terms of time, and you got to work nights and that kind of stuff. But they also don't have this hypervigilance you got to maintain while you're at work, the up and down stress related to higher risk situations that they're going through, and all the bad memories that you live through and become part of you for the rest of your life. And I'll give you an example. And I just read Danny R. Smith's book, Nothing Left to Prove.
Yeah, great book.
He was a homicide detective, 20-plus year veteran in the Sheriff's Department, and he had to leave because of chronic post-traumatic stress. And he freely talks about it in his book and on podcasts, so I'm not letting the cat out of the bag here.
Right, yeah.
But one of the things on the Sheriff's Department and any major city homicide bureau is being on call, or being what we call in the barrel.
In the barrel, 24 hours, yeah.
That's right. And you're in 24 hours, you're catching everything that comes up. And you can see, there's a great show, it's called The First 48.
Yeah, I love it.
And Danny talks about it. That first 48, you're humping because you have to get a lead and catch that guy. Your chances are best in that first 48. So these guys are going top notch, full speed, these homicide guys, without sleep, and they're doing the Lord's work. They're catching murderers, right? to catch these guys, and on top of that, they're seeing the crime scenes, they're seeing the autopsies, they're seeing things that would curl the toes of just about everybody who has to see it, and they see it as part of their job, and they deal with fatigue, and they're overworked. I mean, the average caseload, recommended caseload for a homicide investigator is maybe 3 cases a month, and they might be carrying 30 cases. So these big city or large department homicides are overworked. They're stressed out with the amount of hours they have to work, and then to do the job right, to catch the people, you just got to be that bird dog. You got to be that gumshoe. You got to be putting in all those hours to be successful. And those are the things that caused a great deal of challenges for Danny R. Smith. And I'm confident that that impacts a lot of police officers who go through similar situations, maybe not as severe as being in the barrel in the LA County Sheriff's Homicide Bureau, but there's a lot of other commands and other duties that can be just as, I'm thinking child abuse, or just humping in patrol and working a lot of hours in patrol like we both did, day in and day out.
Yeah.
What Cece talked about is these guys are being drafted up to, I think, 10 shifts a month. So if you do the math, I mean, there's 4 weeks, 10 shifts a month, and you're already doing, let's see, you do 20 shifts a month for your regular, and you're doing 10. So you're doing
96.
Time and so you're doing a ton. 10, that's 80 hours, and actually it's 96, so it's 12 shifts a month. 12 shifts a month. So that's 3 additional shifts a week on top of your 5 that you're already doing.
So when I worked and probably most of your career also, so the maximum overtime you were allowed to work was 96 hours.
Unless it got waived.
Unless it got waived, and people worked more. So now in 30 years, I never hit 96. And actually, I never wanted to hit 96. And I remember, I think the most I ever worked in a month was probably, maybe like 48, maybe. And that was too much for me because I still need to exercise. It was a priority in my mind.
Man, I would work at West Hollywood, do my normal shift, day shift I remember this as a detective, and then I would hang out for 4 hours and catch a 4-hour footbeat spot on the Sunset Strip.
Yeah.
That's how much I needed overtime. And I only hit 96 a couple of times.
But it was rough, right? Was it tough?
And 80. Oh, yeah, it was hard. Yeah, it was hard. That's hard on your body. I mean, think about it. So if you're working 5 days a week and then 3 additional shifts, that means if you catch a double on your weekend, you got to work some other shift during the week, and that's your 3. And just to be clear, so people know, you get off. It's not like you get to go right to bed. You got to drive home, jump into bed. You got to wind down, and if you're lucky, you get 4 good hours of sleep, and then you're on your way back in to do your shift again. And in addition to that, you might have court that you have to go to or other obligations related to your duties. And if you're a parent like I am, you got to drive the kid to soccer practice and pick them up from school and do all the other things. It's not like you're just existing to do the job. In fact, the only reason you're working overtime is to support your family, right? Or you're getting drafted. There was a point in time where I got in a really good spot financially. I mean, I was a lieutenant and I didn't sign up for anything, but every now and then I'd get drafted. So same as a sergeant. I worked really hard to get in a good spot so I didn't have to work it as a sergeant lieutenant.
Yeah.
But you get drafted.
Yeah, there's so many things that go in that could lead to this depression or suicidal tendencies. And we're just talking about one aspect. So you're talking about, and I'm relating this now to my health coach education that I'm going through. And we're talking about this cortisol. So, a lack of sleep will put that. So, a dose of cortisol, which is a hormone for our fight or flight, in brief periods is actually healthy for us. It's the chronic, having chronic, cortisol in our system. So lack of sleep is going to do that. And then you throw on top, like you say, the stress of the job. It's like your system is never able to, what's called homeostasis, right? Get back into balance. So if you're constantly out of balance, it's just after a while, it's got to. So now we're talking about one aspect of that could lead to this thing. So I was going to go into another aspect that could lead to that and pick up something, and then I'm going to get to it. But yeah, I'm thinking about
there's the hypervigilance at work that it compels you to you're constantly trying
Right.
to stay alert, which means you're creating that cortisol that you're talking about, and so that also impacts your weight and impacts a lot of different things. But it also leads a lot of guys into self-medicating. They're drinkers; they become
Thank you.
drinkers, right? And I, let's just say I saw that pretty close to home because I come from a cop family. A lot of drinking, and no doubt in my mind, it was related to dealing with the stress at work. And
Right.
and I'll say, because I had a couple guys on who suffered from post traumatic stress, and I came from a law enforcement family, and I made the conscious decision when I worked, because I wasn't afraid of working the busiest areas. In fact, once you go work there and you're capable, they keep pulling you back. Oh, we got to
Yeah.
get Jordan back in there,
I
right?
enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed it, but I recognized the impact it could have on me,
Right.
and every now and then I would get out. Like, I worked Carson for a couple of years. We had the Carson lobby shooting. We had the chaplain who got murdered, and I was handling that mess. I mean, there were quite a few things that happened. And then I went to Crescenta Valley, and it was like a yawner. But, I was out of the frying pan for a while. I was at a nice, quiet place. It was relatively
Yeah.
close to home. I finished my degree, and then I went to Century,
Yeah.
right, which is right back
Right back
into
in it.
it's jumping, right? And then I went to Compton. So
Yeah.
even busier, right? But
Right.
then I went to West Hollywood. West Hollywood wasn't the same as it had been when I first worked there. It was not quite as busy. And then I went to transit, and so I knowingly got out of those areas where it was jumping all the time, not because I was afraid of any of that, but I go, I don't need to stay here. It's funny because Danny's book says nothing left to prove. I don't need to stay here and prove that I can do this for 20 years. I
Right.
know the
Yeah.
impact that it has. I know I can do it, but I also know the impact it has on me personally and the impact it would have on my family. And so I would go recharge my batteries at a slower place. And if I needed to go back into a busy area for career wise, then I did it. But I didn't stay there and I think that's, if I had one criticism for the guys that stay in those areas, I'd say, come on, man, give back to your family, leave there for a couple of years. You can go back. You don't have, just go recharge your batteries. And I think that's the healthy thing to do if you're working a large agency like the Sheriff's Department, LAPD, NYPD, Chicago, Atlanta, you name them. And you really you need to, your health needs to be a long-term
Yeah.
goal. And if that means you have to maybe leave a station where it is just happening and you love it and all your guys there and go to an investigative assignment for a couple of years or administrative, then do it. You can always go back.
Yeah. And you reminded me what I was going to hit on because we had the sleep deprivation and the overload of working, no time off to, a homeostasis, a balance in your life. But also, so not only, so something, because these guys and gals, and then maybe we'll talk about maybe the male and female suicide rates if there's any data on that. But, there's got to be, because some of these people are just so stable, it seems, there's got to be some kind of maybe change in the brain. I'm thinking about all the injuries that people get also, they not only get into alcohol, but sometimes they get on medication, and then together with everything else, the chemical imbalance that can occur in our brains, I don't know if anybody's really paying attention to that, but I can see that as another pinch point that could drive somebody to these thoughts.
Yeah, I think so. Well, some people have depression in their families, right?
Right, could be
So a person might
hereditary,
go
yeah.
into law enforcement and they might already be predisposed, right?
Right,
And I think as an administrator, as a public policymaker, regardless of where you're at, there should be some compelled engagement to overcome those things because you don't know who they are.
right,
You're never going to know because the law enforcement's a culture where you're not sharing vulnerabilities. You're not going to share them, right? It's not going to happen. And when one of the
no,
events that it lives with me forever is the Chatsworth train crash. So we
yeah,
had
wow,
25 dead, 40 seriously injured, and I was fairly close to it when it came off, and I was called and said, "Hey, go take over and become, the incident commander." And so I came, and I actually ended up being in a unified command situation with who is now the chief of police, Michael Moore of LA, and the fire services, LA City Fire. But I had to walk past the bodies. I mean, they had the black tarp out.
Was that 2004? When was that?
That was, I want to say it's 2011, and they had
2011. Okay, yeah.
They had they had the red tarp out, they had the yellow tarp out, they had the dead, the dying, the ones we could save, and we didn't have enough firemen, right? We didn't have paramedics. The search and rescue folks came. Our paramedics from the sheriff's department came. It was a big event. We flew 25 people out on helicopters with injuries, and then the rest had to, we had to take out by ambulance. But you couldn't. It was just one of those places you couldn't get to. But I had to climb over the railroad tracks, climb over a fence, and walk past all these people who were dead and dying because I was supposed to take charge.
And it was a CJ deputy on the train.
It was a court deputy who was on the train, and he had his radio, and he was busted up pretty bad. But what we did is the deputies were some of our deputies were the first ones there. So they beat fire guys there. So they're helping fire guys extract people from this train, this burning train. They had to actually cut people in half to get other people out, and then other deputies who weren't doing the rescue were, they were holding hands with people who ultimately died. I mean, it was not a good experience. And then immediately after we got everything where it was, the rescues were done, the patients were out of there, I pulled the first of the first responders together, and we did a quick debrief with psychological services. And you could tell people were impacted. But it wasn't until I actually sat down with each one of them individually. We identified who the first of the first responders were. And these guys, they broke down. Some of these guys just broke down in my office. I mean, it was the most gut-wrenching thing that I had to do. And I had my own memories. I mean, the next day, I'm handling this mess, and I have to get up early to drive my daughter to college. And I broke down right there reading the headlines. And I'm holding it together. I'm fine. And then I got my coffee going. I was going to read the headlines and the news a little bit. Boom. That was it. I'm in the dark, got my coffee, and I lose it. And this is the first time I actually lost it like that. And I wasn't the guy pulling the bodies out of the train. I wasn't the guy holding the hands of the people who were dying. That wasn't me. I was the guy in charge. I still had the survivor's remorse. I still have guilt. I still felt I could have done something more. And I wasn't the guy who was the first person dealing with these patients who passed away. And so I understood, what happened to me. And you times that by 10 for these guys who were immediately dealing with these patients. And there is no doubt in my mind they live with that pain today.
Yeah. Is that something so when you did, was that something you initiated, or was there a matrix for that came down, this is what, after a traumatic incident, this is what we do to help the employees, or no?
Psychological services, that's what they do initially. And then I was asked to interview them for two things, to see if they needed help, but also to vet them to see, we were going to give life-saving and valor awards to certain people. And so I was trying to figure out who fit that criteria. And so it's kind of a combination effort. And we did, I think the thing that I came away with is if you don't have psychological services and you're a sheriff somewhere or a chief of police or a policymaker, is assume the worst, engage as soon as possible, and then do ongoing engagement. We did recommend some of those guys go on for psychological. I called in psychological services and asked them to do outreach for some of the folks, and just based upon what I found out. And I will say I'm guilty of being that guy who said I don't need it.
Right. Yeah.
I'm guilty. Guilty as charged. And I acted in a way that was in the best interest of my staff, but I didn't follow my own advice. And we have to get past that.
Yeah. I was in a shooting. I know I had 4 days to make an appointment with psych services, and you had to have that interview before you could go back to the field. But there's nothing after. They should have that for a traumatic incident. They should know you before you even go back to work. You have to talk to somebody about it, even if you're not having any troubles, because at least what they do is check with you. Hey, any bad dreams? Some people do, some people don't. There's no right or wrong answer to that.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is so obviously this was very traumatic, right? And you knew that people were suffering, but
Right,
there's so
yeah.
many things that you don't know. Um, I remember you remember the street Melrose Place in West
Yeah,
Hollywood?
of course.
So it did kind of a bend, and it bent to so it was two streets, and it was this Melrose Place was kind of an island, and it wasn't a movie show or TV show like all these
Right,
guys are
yeah.
thinking, oh, I remember Melrose Place. No, there was
Yeah.
kind of an island and a bunch of businesses that were kind of on this island, and they had these low, maybe 6 or 8 inch islands with
Right, yeah.
traffic structures on them. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So a car hit that, and it ended up rolling and flipping and the driver who was drunk ended up being tossed in the plate glass window. And I got there shortly after that happened, and one of the shards of glass had lodged itself in his neck, but he was still alive. But I wasn't going to be able to save him. I
Right.
remember that.
Yeah. I think
I
my
was
wife
there
was
when he
on that
died.
call too. I think she was on that.
I remember
Yeah.
that to this day. The car landed against the light standard. It came down.
Yeah.
But I remember that one. I got a call of a person stabbed. It was two male prostitutes fighting over drugs, and guy caught a knife to the descending aorta. I get there, he's alive, he's talking, and he dies in my arms. I remember that,
Yeah.
you know, and I can go on and
Me
on,
too.
right?
Yeah.
So I can talk about the Chatsworth train crash, but I remember all of these other incidents like
Yeah.
they were yesterday because they were very traumatic injuries in which people died, and I couldn't save them, and I was there. And just think about the police officers around the country who deal with this, and nobody ever asks them, "How are you doing?
Yeah, I know.
How are you doing?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? Hey, you handled that guy that died yesterday. You weren't able to save him. Hey, come on, let's talk about that."
Yeah.
Doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen. Yeah, and the it goes along with it. Now I always did it because maybe it seems like you can kind of you almost have to self-help yourself, to a wellness program. Even though we have wellness programs in the department, it seems like you have to seek it out. It's not going to be kind of really forced into it. Maybe in circumstances we should be, because I'm thinking, and I always took, of course, I had a place to go in upstate New York, our island. I always took my vacations, every year. And my wife did too. But some of these people, they go just because of the incentive of being able to cash in that vacation at the end of your career, and it's money,
Yeah.
it goes towards your retirement. Some of these people never take a vacation. Some people die with their vacation still on the books. I mean, isn't it kind of crazy that they kind of work themselves into unhealthy lifestyle and can really impact them mentally?
Well, I know that as I was dealing with what was clearly to me probably post-traumatic stress, because here's as our career went on. I mean, when we first started, I don't think anybody really. I never heard the phrase post-traumatic stress.
No.
Anymore.
Yeah, you didn't.
Suck it up, go back in there. It's like, and that was the way I grew up playing sports. Suck it up,
Yeah,
just
me too.
get back in there, right? And I be honest with you, I think it wasn't until they started talking about post-traumatic stress with sexual assault victims that it really started entering the popular culture that people who deal with trauma have post-traumatic stress injuries. It's certainly the military who are in combat, but I don't think they ever thought of cops and firemen until probably in the last 20 years. And I know the sheriff's department always had psychological services, but
Yeah.
I still don't believe that as a profession it was identified as a clear threat to the health of police officers till recently.
If I was going to be part of the reform of police officers, I would make it, number one, I would make it a mandatory, a yearly assessment on fitness. And I also would make it maybe a mandatory assessment on psychological well-being too. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, in my research, when I was getting ready for my show, one of the things that shocked me, and I looked at a study out of Boston University, was that smaller agencies, 50 or less, they were like 4 times higher.
I saw that too. Yeah.
That their staffs would likely suffer from suicide, which indicated to me that there was, even though the sheriff's department this past year blew off those, I mean, we blew the curve there. That smaller agencies suffer from this the most. And so if I had as I said earlier in the show, let's say it's presumptive, and let's do compelled conversation on a regular basis. And you can do this as a sergeant.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about what happened yesterday. We had this, car accident, the family wiped out. Let's talk about how everybody's feeling, and start that conversation. And that just needs to be part of the culture of law enforcement now, that the injury is there. So let's
Yeah.
talk about it. And then you train your sergeants and lieutenants and even the chief in these smaller agencies. It might just be the chief as the only supervisor, right? To look for those signs and compel people to go get treatment. Kind of the way I thought about it. God, if I'm like a chief and I got like 10 guys working for me, and my county counterpart, the sheriff, he's got maybe 50 guys working for him. We're in that risk category, and maybe there's
Yeah.
another couple cities in the county that have small. Then I need to get together with my partners and come up with a plan. I need to
Yeah.
talk to them and say, hey, this is what I'm aware of. Let's develop a strategy. Let's find a provider that's close for all of us, and let's compel our folks who go through traumatic injuries to go talk to that provider. Whether it's
Yeah.
an annual thing, but certainly an annual thing could compel the conversation. And so I agree with that too. But yeah, there needs to be some compelled engagement.
Yeah. And just, man, I don't know, having people involved in outside activities, it used to be really a priority to do that. Yeah, one of I really, like you maybe, I look back, the first guy I knew was at Temple Station, and we were good friends. We used to golf once a week, and he became involved in some uh, problems with his wife and somebody else. And I remember going away, and he was one of those guys, very quiet. He wasn't like me, who could blow up or be over emotional or sensitive. He was very stable, and we had a great time. And then I was away at my upstate island, and his wife had called me and said, "Oh, Cliff, I think Mitch I think he could kill himself." And I thought, that doesn't seem right. But let me call Javier, and get a thing on that. And so I called him, and he goes, "Cliff, I already talked to Mitch, and he said, yeah, stop it. I'm fine." He really blew it off. He goes, "I wouldn't even talk to him about it because he's kind of defensive about it." And the thing is, a week prior to him shooting himself, he had actually at Temple, a guy was on a bridge and going to jump off. He had tackled the guy and saved him. But you always wonder, is there something I missed or could have said or done? I don't know. Do you ever have those feelings? Or
Fortunately, nobody really super close to me committed suicide. But when I look at this, I think, well, we know that there's precursors, but even if we don't see them, we know that the injury is there. So
right?
let's
Yeah.
do the compelled engagement. Let's get involved, and let's, with shootings, we demand people go see the psychologist, and
Right.
they got to make that appointment within 5 days. As I guess you're aware of, I've never had to go through the process.
Yeah.
I've only had to advise people the process, right? And
It's
but
funny
I
because
think
the time I had to go, the guy I talked to is a great guy. I can't think of his name right now, but he would come up to Universal and talk to our friend, our sergeant. He lived in West Hollywood. He had a pig, I'm talking about. He's a great guy. I ended
yeah,
up becoming great friends with him, but
yeah, I know who you're talking
yeah.
about. He was kind of a shorter
Yeah.
guy and
Yeah.
or beard kind of guy.
Yeah.
I forget his name now. I can see him.
But he's a good
Um,
guy, man. He was really a good asset to the department, but I mean, he's not really a member of the department, but they
well, I think the
contracted him.
department too needs to. So a lot of the department of psychological services. That's why I asked CC the question. Like, are they still using interns? Because what happens is they need to get their hours, and so they'll
Right.
work
Yeah.
under the authority of a psychologist or psychiatrist. I can't remember which, and then they get their hours, and then they'll leave. And I just think we need to uh, have stability in those offices. Pay full boat for people who are trained. Let them specialize in dealing with law enforcement and keep those people on board, and develop a strategy to mitigate the injuries that are leading to the suicides across the board. And we should be doing it in partnership with the fire department. It's pretty clear they see a lot of trauma too. So
Oh man. Yeah.
it should be, but we have a lot of cop hating politicians. I mean, the person in the second district, Holly Mitchell, she hates cops. She's not going to fund any of that stuff, and we have to get past that. We have to, and that's the other thing we haven't talked about that we do talk on my show, is there is a sense of betrayal by law enforcement, by all this anti-cop rhetoric that is unfair, untrue, but causes people to withdraw, and not seek help because they're kind of hopeless. And I think my guest talked about it. Yeah, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of either supervision who was at the time. What happens is sometimes supervisors, they go a little too overboard in trying to appease the political folks, and I think that they can say that's a little bit of criticism with our current sheriff, that he's too busy trying to appease the leftists, and he needs to be focused on the health of his organization and his staff. So there's a feeling of betrayal by deputies against senior management, and a feeling of betrayal by law enforcement and the general public, and it's who are vocal, because what I know is the vast majority of the public supports us, but they're not vocal. It's these
Right.
all cops are bastards crowds that seem to have control of the narrative, and we need to address that and recognize that's
Yeah.
causing injury, because you add that on top of the actual psychological injuries that people go through, this betrayal, and then the long hours and everything else that compounds.
I was going to ask you, and maybe you pretty much already answered it, but maybe you can go deeper into that, because I'm remembering. So after 9/11, I'm at Universal. I was on my way to Universal when 9/11 occurs. First tower goes down. I'm on the 134. On the second tower, I'm at the briefing room in Universal for the first time in known history, according to my Lieutenant Brad Welker. Right, the City Walk has never been closed down. We're driving a sheriff's car down the middle of the City Walk at Universal, and it's just a ghost town because everything is shut down. And I'm rewriting a book on my memoir, and I was talking about an incident that happened. We used to be hired at the Universal Amphitheater for overtime to certain concerts, and we really our duty was outside the venue because they had a lot of security. But we would walk around inside the building, but kind of the outskirts of the house per se. But I remember we were walking. This could have been months after 9/11, or it wasn't that long, but we're walking outside the main venue, but we're inside the building. And I remember an elderly lady, she was right outside the door looking at her ticket. And we just happened to know, just from being there, so we kind of know the sections. And so her seat was really just inside the door, maybe 10 rows down. So I said, let me just walk you to your seat. And so I walked her in the door, and I sat her down in her seat. And it was probably 20 minutes before the concert was starting. So the house lights are up. Just sitting this lady down, then I turned, the whole crowd stood up and applauded me. Can you imagine that was the attitude? I'm almost tearing up over this because, we were alive to experience this. People just wanted to have their pictures taken with us. An American officer, a cop, I want to be seen with you. I want to thank you. People just wanted to hug you. So I just wanted the impact now with this anti-cop rhetoric and this propaganda that's totally a lie, how this is affecting the mentality of the cops today. And it seems like you have a pulse on that.
Well, it's first of all, they're having a hard time hiring, right? I just did a show where they were paying $75,000 bonus for people who hired into the process. The city of Alameda, which is up in northern California, it was on an article by Cal Matters, and they danced around the fact of the negativity against law enforcement is one of the reasons why people aren't hiring on. But in terms of the context of post-traumatic or suicides, I mean, think about that. You go to work, you do a good job, you save people's lives, and you come home and people call you names. And I will say, I come from a cop family, and I have
me
to deal
too.
with
Yeah.
family members that say, well,
Yeah.
I said, no, I don't have to.
That's not true. No.
I'm not, you're going along with the lie.
Yeah.
And you're going along with the lie. What do you mean I have to acknowledge there are bad cops out there? That's the lie that they compel anybody who speaks up for cops must say, well, there are some bad cops out there. And I'm saying, you know what? I worked 38 years in law enforcement. They're few and far between. But you're compelled to say, even though you have multiple cops in your family that are retired, to say this because you've been conditioned to say this.
Correct.
And that's one of the reasons why I like my show. It's like, I have two shows that I'm working on developing, two podcasts. One is to deconstruct the lies about the disparate sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder, because one of the reasons why law enforcement is not being effectively used to deal with fentanyl is the lie that it was part of a racist least systemic system. And if you actually go back and read congressional records, if you go back and look and see who pushed for it, there were black leaders who were pushing for a tougher sentence on crack cocaine because it was destroying their community, as you know, because you
Exactly.
work those
Yeah.
streets,
Oh,
right?
yeah, that's right. I
Yeah,
can't, and like you were saying, it's not popular. Even back in the 80s, they couldn't say it out front of the house, but behind the scenes, if you're running through a backyard, I mean, and specifically in the black community, they were just so thankful we were there. Thank you so much for being here.
right.
I
And
can't
that
tell
and
you
that's
how
a
many
lie.
times. Yeah.
So the political class has said all those people who worked all those years were just part of some racist conspiracy to
Yeah.
oppress black people in particular, when in reality we were sent and given these laws to enforce to save lives, which we did. And when
Yep.
you actually do research, you can look at the Manhattan Institute, the War on Cops, and the other one was, I think, Injustice, two
Yep.
books. They lay it all out. You just need to do a little bit of exploration. You find out that that's all a lie. I think the other one that I was looking into was oh my god, now I'm losing it. I just
Well, I'll go along with what you're saying. And part of the problem is, which is true, sometimes either the public to a mass extent will have no personal contact with a police officer, or it's maybe a negative contact with a ticket.
yeah.
And so they're really just going off on that propaganda. To tell you the truth, I really never thought it should be allowed. I didn't think that you should be putting out movies and TV shows showing, look at these cops doing these, putting people in mind, this is what cops do, when it's just a story. I don't think it's good for society.
When I do the cop movies and talk about them, I'll say, okay, this is not realistic. I'm at the
Right. Yeah.
training day, and yeah, there was some correspondence with some corrupt cops in L.A. to that movie, but it was
Correct.
nothing.
Yeah.
Training day was so far, out of the pale. It was absurd, but that's what people come away with.
Yeah.
That's what this is all about. And so I think just the negative narrative about law enforcement is compounding the post-traumatic stress injuries that these guys have, compounding because the
Yeah.
defund the police movement only reduced the number of law enforcement officers that are available to deal with the crime that is increasing. So
Correct. Yeah.
so it's kind of the
Yeah.
perfect storm. Let's cut the staff, watch the crime spike, force them to work long hours, and then call them all bad names, and we wonder why there's more suicides.
I guess we're doing pretty good for 2022 and 23. I guess 2019 was one of the highest, 168 or
For
something like that
for what?
for police suicides.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I came away with when I did my research is more people are dying of suicide
Then
than are dying
from street shootings
street shootings. Yes.
or anything, all combined, whether it's accidents or anything, almost 3 times we're dying of our own guns than somebody shooting us, which is crazy. Yeah. And I like the fact that maybe the only good thing about the FBI is that they gather statistics and give you a report. So are you familiar with, I guess in 2022, they came up with the law enforcement suicide, what is it called? The something, oh my God. It's about the data collection. Yeah, Law Enforcement Suicide Data Collection Act. It came in 2022.
Was that a federal?
Yeah, Federal Bureau of Investigation. They launched the LESDC to provide a mechanism for law enforcement agencies to report suicides and attempted suicides of law enforcement personnel as defined within the Law Enforcement Suicide, what I call it, Data Collection Act. So compiling national data, because, it's not always accurate. People don't always report these things, right?
No, and because people don't want to talk about them dying of suicide. It might hit their insurance thing, or embarrass. Might give the family a bad name. We don't know if those attitudes still exist around the country. So I am glad they're gathering numbers. But again, I got to go back to it should be presumptive that they're dealing with this. And there's a lot of people who may not use a gun, but drink themselves to death slowly over 20 years. After they finish their career, or after they deal with their chronic post-traumatic stress. So it's not just the sudden, I'm taking my life. It's the slow killing.
Right. Did
Killing.
you look into anything? Just on the aftermath of the 4 that we had in 24 hours, they talk about a contagion or contagious, suicide, right?
I was aware of that from a previous, because I've been tracking suicides in LA County for a while, and so I've been
Wow.
reading on material. So there's a couple of data points that I think when you monitor them, they give you a good idea whether the treatment model versus law enforcement model is actually working. And what I mean by that is a lot of the social justice warriors say, well, they need a doctor and a social worker. They don't need cops, right? So you've heard that mantra, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So what would be 2 data sets that you could look at in which law enforcement doesn't necessarily impact, but would indicate whether treatment is actually working? And 2 of them are overdoses and suicides. So these are the 2 that I track, right? Because law enforcement on overdoses and suicides. Overdoses, they can impact an overdose by, interdicting the narcotics coming into the community, making arrests of people that are users, and maybe interfere with their overdose, right? But if you pull cops out and it's all treatment, then if treatment is effective, theoretically you should see a reduction in overdoses. Not happening. Absolute spike in overdoses in LA County has been going on since a very long time.
Yeah.
The other one I looked at was suicides, and because I figured, okay, so if you're in the life and you're drinking a lot, or you're using drugs, then the likelihood of suicide would probably increase as we pull back engagement with law enforcement. And what I was seeing was a steady increase in suicides, and which gets you to be thinking about contagion and all the things that you're talking about. We saw a dip surprisingly during COVID, and then now it's spiking again, and it's spiking mostly amongst men, white men in particular. I don't understand the dynamic, but contagion means once somebody commits suicide in a group, it's likely to lead others to think that that's a path for solving their pain and committing suicide. So whether there's I don't know if these 4 people knew each other, so whether it was a contagion event in the sheriff's department, I can't say that, but I do understand the dynamic of a contagion event, and that it really is impactful for teenagers and young adults.
Well, the one I know, his dad had committed suicide, like in his garage, and he kind of ended up doing the same thing. Yeah, it's almost, I was watching A Wonderful Life again, and it's almost, man, I'm like, watch this movie because of all these people I know that I knew, the one thing they wouldn't want to do is hurt other people. And that's the one thing that they're doing by doing this act, is really destroying a lot of other people. They're creating a lot of hurt. And the fact, man, the one great thing about that movie, it's kind of an anti-suicide movie, I think, because he's showing his life. This is what would happen if you never were born, because, he gets to that despair and he says, I wish I'd never been born. And then, the angel says, listen, there's an idea. I can show him what his life would be like. What would have happened if he hadn't touched all these other people? And so, man, don't kill yourself, because you have no idea. Never underestimate the power of your positive influence on other people, man. Don't do it. And the other crazy thing, I guess, not understanding it would be an escape of pain, but this life, I don't know. Maybe because we're on the second half of it, I latch onto it because it's really, really short. And so you're going to die anyways, dude. You only got like another 40 years left. What are you doing? I don't know.
I think we have to get people focused on the positive. When you look back at your career,
yeah,
and you think of the guy that died when he crashed his car, or the prostitute that got stabbed or whatever. For every one of those, there's some positive thing that you did in your career.
Absolutely,
maybe that you saved. I remember I went to this old lady. Her husband died, and they're in the Fairfax area, old Jewish couple. She must have been married to the guy for like 70 years, and and he died, and he's in the next room laying there, and she was just completely out of sorts, right? And her family wasn't close, and I stayed there with her.
Yeah.
Held her hand, called the coroner, called the doctor, got it all going. And I was with her for 3 hours. And I remember that because I was so proud that I was able to give her the compassionate touch that she needed at the time. And I remember that as much as I remember the trauma. And I think sometimes the guys who get stuck on the trauma forget there's so many people that you
Yeah.
helped out along the way. And for whatever reason,
I'll try to
you know,
maintain my composure, but that reminds me. So I had in the book I was talking about a guy who had worked a double shift. I think he might have been a doctor, but he fell asleep at the wheel as they do in upstate New York and these rural roads many times. And he went across the. It was a hot night. He went across the road. He ends up just hitting the guardrail, and then his head flopped out and got trapped between the guardrail and his car and killed him. There really was hardly any damage to his car at all. And I just remember going to his wife's house with a neighbor and a clergy. I mean, the desk called the clergy person and a neighbor, which was nice. And I remember I took her to the hospital, and I remember going down to the morgue and just her reaching out and touching his cheek. That just moment, it just stays with me all the time. Just that moment, she just wanted to reach out and touch his cheek one more time. It's just those, like you say, I got about 20 of those moments that I think about, but I do reframe them. In other words, I think about those moments and also people that aren't here anymore, and I just think, man, I'm still here right now. You know what I mean? I'm latching on to that as an energy for me.
Yeah.
Even though we all have. I don't think there's anything. I think there's probably a difference. Maybe you can speak to between sadness, natural sadness, and reflect on something that's sad, and depression or clinical depression. There's a difference.
Yeah, that's why I say you have to do the outreach, because there might be people who are clinically depressed, and there might be people it runs in their family. But I also trying to get people, like when I did the trash or train crash, a lot of there were some guys who they were just holding hands with people that were going to die. And
Yeah.
right?
Oh my God.
And one guy, he just was struggling, and I had to tell him, I go, hey, listen, what their family is coming away with is somebody was there with them. It was preordained they were going to die once that crash happened. But somebody was there with them to comfort them and be with them as they died. And unfortunately, you couldn't save them, but your role was very important, and you need to understand that. You were there to comfort them at a time when they needed you. And sometimes that's all you can do. And and that's why I think we need to do outreach to reframe some of this stuff so officers understand, hey, you can't be the hero every time, but being the hero that holds the hand of the person who passes away, and you can't bring their daughter there, but you can be there and be a good person for that person. So I think there's so many positive stories that we don't see as positive, and yet they are. And so that's why I think the engagement is important, and that's why
I wonder, maybe you can speak to this. I wonder if it's healthy or unhealthy that. So me, I'm emotional. So I'll cry at a commercial. We went to see this movie the other day. I highly recommend. It's called The Boys in the Boat. It's about those Washington rowers. Have you heard of that movie?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just. I was crying during this movie, but so on the job, that would never happen. I would walk over bodies. You know what I mean? So that was probably a self-protective mental attitude that I had as putting on that uniform and doing that. That would never come close to me tearing up on the job. But yet I'll cry in a commercial on my couch. So I wonder, is that a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing? I wonder.
It's probably unhealthy, but the way I tell people is, hey, I'm a pretty good actor. When I have to
no, that's
tough,
right. Yeah.
When I have to be tough, the guy thinks I'm tough because I'm acting tough.
No, you know what? I think I was more that.
I do that. You know what I mean? It's like I have to switch into these roles. When I have to be loud and commanding, then I can be loud.
No, that's what I would do, because I remember going in and yelling at, get off this bus now, or I'll take your head off. Get it, everybody off here. And then I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe somebody said to me, wow, you were really mad. And not really. I wasn't really mad, but I knew that was going to get the job done. And people kind of sense, oh, I better do what he's saying. So yeah, it's authentic enough that people buy into it because you're using it to get the job done. It's something similar you might do people would say, well, you shouldn't be cursing, but sometimes it becomes a tool in communication.
So I think you mask your real nature to get the job done, right? In
Right.
a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
ways, and it's needed and it's necessary. I mean, I was at the scene of a shooting where a deputy was shot and seriously injured, and he worked with these guys for a long time, and the guys on a shift, and I was new to this group of guys. I was the supervisor, and they were all out of sorts. I mean,
Yeah.
these are good cops,
Yeah.
and I had to say, hey, we have an asshole to catch. Let's go.
Yeah.
Where's the command post? Where's the containment? And they just looked at me and said, yes, sir. And they were off and running. And so every now and then you have to get in that role and take them out of it. Hey, this ain't the time to mope
No.
around. We got and we caught him that night. So, uh, but every now and then so it happens and you get in that role. Was I as impacted as those guys? Well, I didn't know the guys as much because I was responsible for them. So clearly I had issues, but I also had a role that night, and that night
Yeah,
was
that's right.
to lead, and I had to lead, and these guys had to do their part to catch these guys, and they did.
Double digit times, I was the guy. So when someone's in a shooting, or they shoot and kill somebody, double digit times I was the guy who took the deputy back. They didn't let him drive the car; they kept it drive.
Yeah.
And so double digit times I was the guy who took the deputy back to the station. And probably it was 10, 12 different reactions. I mean, guys were just, some guys were talking normally. Oh man, this happened and that happened, and we would talk. And what do you do? We weren't supposed to talk about the incident, but we would talk about other things, as if we were just having a cup of coffee. And then there were guys who would just have a death stare on the way back to the station. I mean, they didn't talk. So people reacted differently to that crisis, right, that they were involved in. And so it was kind of interesting to watch in real time. But it showed that everybody reacts differently to these similar things.
I think they do, and remember, they were just all in a traumatic incident,
Right, yeah.
and they reacted differently. And that's obviously what's the first thing we do? We sit them down and we grill them about their, what happened, which is, I mean, if you ever go through classes where it talks what happens to people physiologically, and one of the ones that does it is force science, does a pretty good job, they're going through a whole bunch of emotions that we don't even acknowledge because we have a process we have to do, and I can imagine the fear, even if it's masked, the fear that every one of them is going through, because they know no matter how clean it was, it's going to be second guessed.
Exactly, especially now.
Yeah. So they went through the fear of the event, they relived that event, and now they're facing the fear of the unknown, whether they'll be supported or not.
Oh man. Well, we'll start to wind down here, but I wonder, in comparison, it seems almost minuscule, right? When we talk about, we had 145 cops die this year, which I think is around what we're doing about now. But when you think about, so I guess it's gone down from 22 a day to 17 a day. You're talking about 6,000 veterans that kill themselves a year. Wow, the disparity. But it's PTSD, right? A lot of it is unaddressed.
I imagine the Veterans Administration probably does address it, more so than they used to. And this is where I really get frustrated with a lot of our lefties who are anti-military, is these guys, September 11th came, they went and volunteered. They went to war.
Correct.
Many of them did multiple tours to defend our country.
Yeah.
And a lot of these lefties who were in charge now went to college. They didn't go fight.
Right.
And now they denigrate our military. I struggle with that. Same with law enforcement. They denigrate our law enforcement. I think the thing that about the suicide deaths for officers is, and this is why I did a show, is it's not talked about. That's
exactly
the problem. The problem is this is something that could be managed better, and we could reduce the numbers, but the will has to be there to do it.
The will, yeah.
The will, and that's the policymakers establishing an environment where police officers are able to talk, without any kind of recrimination or any kind of judgment, and as I said, assume the injury's there, treat the injury. Don't wait till it manifests itself in some other way. Just assume the injury's there and treat the injury.
Yeah, based on data, like you say, you know it's there. It doesn't matter that you don't see it. That's the problem, right? Because he's not, hey, you got a broken arm. It's pretty evident. We don't know if we have a little broken psyche part that we need to fix. It's not visible.
Yeah, I think my guest characterizes, he says, the average person might have a handful of traumatic events in their life, where
Right,
cops
yeah.
might deal with hundreds every year.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Man, jeez. Well, listen, I think, do you have any other, are you involved in any other way with kind of suicide prevention in law enforcement, or you just bringing light to it, or?
No, I mean, one of the things I recognize is I do my show, like I just did the show with Danny R. Smith, and he had to retire due to chronic PSTD. My goal is to tell the stories of police officers as I go on. Like I want to do a review of somebody's story maybe every month, and I have an FBI agent, Steve Friend, coming on. His is going to be more frustration with the system than Danny R. Smith's
Yeah.
challenges with post-traumatic stress. But I know as I work hard to tell those stories of police officers that this subject is going to intersect in those stories fairly regular. And so my goal is just to be able to talk about it and let these guys who have decided to put their stories down on paper, let them talk about it and do awareness that way. So I use my podcast, both of them actually, as an avenue to talk about that stuff.
That's great that you're doing that. And that was the impetus for me writing The Truth About Cops and Why You Should Trust Them, just kind of highlight what the background process is and what actually agencies go through to hire a cop, and how it's pretty darn hard to even get the job, and how, if you realize that people who do backgrounds go back to childhood, go back to previous employers, go back to previous neighbors, go to colleges and the police departments where they went to school, and they research these things, and they vehemently go over their social media platforms in an effort to really filter out bad characters who might have bad motives to get into the job, that it would kind of give some resolve to the true facts. It was what you're highlighting, which I applaud you for doing that, because it kind of invites a little bit of pushback from anti-police people.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with one last comment around the anti-police people, just to frame it so that people understand. So years ago, I was an instant commander, and I was dealing with protests for anarchists, and the anarchists were their precursor to Antifa, right? And they use a strategy called the black bloc. So everybody wears black. It's not really an organization. It's just tactics that they use. And they were interviewing somebody who used these tactics back then. And they said, well, why do you throw bottles and rocks and all that? Cops are essentially come from blue collar. Why do you do that?
Right.
And he said, because they're the guard dogs of the rich. They're the guard dogs of the rich. And I tell that story because I want people to understand that the folks on the left wish you to think that cops were less than human. Because when you say a cop is the guard dog for the rich, you're implying that he or she is less than human. And so what you do to them and what you say about them is okay because they're less than human.
Correct, yeah.
And that treatment of them based upon your political beliefs, your ideology, does have an impact, and it impacts the men and women, and it could negatively impact the men and women in law enforcement by leading to an increased number of suicides.
Yeah. Boy, that's so true, man. Yeah, and it's just, unless you, and it's funny because if you're a police officer, you're either a mother, a father, son, daughter, brother, or sister, and then you know the truth, and those around you know the truth, and as you start to expand, the knowledge of what the true profession is gets diluted, and more, they can get influenced by the propaganda that comes out, that I think is just a detriment to the country.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah, I'm almost tempted. I'll get your opinion on the air here, because I'm almost tempted. Someone I follow is Victor David Hansen, who's a professor from California. Actually, I think he was actually a Democrat, or
he's at Stanford. He's the Hoover Institute.
Yeah,
so
the Hoover Institute, correct. And there's only a couple colleges that really Like Hillsdale College has totally refused to take federal funds, so that they are not subject to their control, really. But what I'm really fascinated by, and I'm almost thinking it may be a theme for my next year, and start the is this they're trying to do away with the citizen. The citizenship is just being destroyed purposefully. I feel like just based on, citizenship used to afford you certain services, and then not anymore. There's no distinction. It used to afford you certain other benefits, and no more. And it used to be that you couldn't vote unless you were a citizen, and now in many places you can. And now, and it used to be you couldn't hold office, but I think now you can even hold office, right, as a non-citizen. Am I correct?
Well, I think you're looking at it from what's the benefit of a citizen, and if you look at it from Western political thought, which I know you're going to do,
Yeah.
there's obligations as a citizen, and when you begin to, because one of the reasons why they had the vote only for men, but way back when, was men served in the military, so there was an
Right. Yeah.
obligation before you got that vote,
Gotcha.
and
Right.
and that's, I think, where we're losing it. We're not, if we place obligations on people before they get to rights of citizenships. And one of the obligations in our democracy is, it's a social contract that we have, that you're going to abide by these things that we call the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and all those things. And in exchange for that, so will I. It's a social contract between me and you. And what we're saying is, oh, well, we're not going to hold certain people to that contract, yet we'll give them the benefit. And I think that's really the way to look at it. As a citizen, you're required to invest and take on obligations, and then you benefit from that social contract and that agreement. What we're doing is we're taking away the obligation and just giving away the benefits, and that's disastrous. Because, I mean, if you frame September 11th between those who felt the obligation and served and those who didn't, and then how do we treat those two
Yeah.
different groups?
Right.
Those who served are suffering and struggling, and maybe they're doing well. Those who didn't became college professors, and are responsible for the anti-Semitism on our college campuses now, right? I
Right.
mean, I would say that we're not requiring people to live up to their obligations as citizens, and yet we give away the benefits to everybody.
Well, I think the fight has to be to really fight for our sovereignty here, because the efforts for globalization is not going to be good. It can't work. And we have to try to deracialize everything, because, as he said, this is what I'm quoting him, he said, to be racist to rectify past racism is not a formula for success. We have to hold on to the things that still make us the greatest. You just can't do what we do in other countries. And so we got to hold on to those things, because, I can't go to Japan and be Japanese. It can't happen. But anybody can come here and be American, because it's an ideal. And so in that regard, I'm fighting into this. We got to start fighting for the citizenship to be just as important, and to remain a republic, which I think I need to look more into how the Roman Empire fell, because they got away from the republic, and they kind of went to not a globalization, but kind of a Mediterranean, mentality, instead of a republic that was people governing themselves and having an elected official, as opposed to a monarchy. And man, we got to keep the middle class, right? Because they want to shrink that down, and that's in Rome. That used to be the governing section, the farmers and the people who worked the land and owned the land and the property, and all these things that I'm learning now. As you start to look at America, that people are trying to tear that apart, and some of these things don't make sense, right? If you look at,
Well,
go ahead, yeah, I'm ranting.
I know you are. I think this comes out of that whole theory of critical race theory and intersectionality, where power is, there's the oppressors, and you're seeing this play out after October 7th. There's the oppressors and the oppressed, and that's how they define the world. And the values that we call Western political thought, from the Greeks and the Romans, are just cast as the musing of old dead white men. And the interesting thing about if you take the time to do the research into critical race theory, and I won't say that I've done enough to really fully understand it, but one of the things that it comes out what they call critical theory. Critical theory comes from what they call the Frankfurt Institute, if you get a chance to read it. And it was a bunch of old, now dead white men who came out of Frankfurt, Germany, and they fled Hitler, and then they formed this concept of power dynamics and group power dynamics,
Yeah.
and that's what controls everything. So the dominant group will always use their power to oppress others, and that was their thinking, as opposed to, so it was groupthink basically, and group power versus the power of the individual, which comes out of enlightenment and comes out of the citizen obligations of the Greeks. And so the Western political thought that we're talking about, where it's the primacy of the individual, yet they supported the primacy of the group and group dynamics and group power. It's interesting because critical theory gave way to feminist critical theory, which gave way to, so there's this progression from the Frankfurt Institute in critical theory to feminist critical theory and this other and critical race theory. If you start doing that, and it's all really about power dynamics between groups,
Right.
and that's going to destroy us, because the whole thing
Yeah.
about the American experience is the melting pot. We all come together, and it's really the individual rights that we did not always live up to, but it was really
Right.
the striving for the individual rights and the rights and those ideals that have made America strong over the years. And yet we're going to the Balkanization of our country that has actually made the Balkans pretty weak over the years, because that's where we fight that's where we got
Yeah.
a war going on right now, right? So yeah, so it would be an interesting thing if you looked into those dynamics if you're going to explore that over the years. I would suggest you take a look at this.
I will take a look at that, because I'm getting my warrior hat on. I was watching, I mean, just a fascinating podcast. She has great guests on. She had Tucker Carlson on. Roseanne Barr is really taken on, and she really looks into a lot of things. Her and her son have a great podcast, and she had, I don't know how you feel about it, but she had Marjorie Taylor Greene on the other day, and she said,
fireworks, and
she is like, but she was made of, she goes, you know what, though, but hey, when we get to heaven, I want to be, I want to be battle scarred, that I did the best fight that I could here, instead of, because a part of me says, I'm sitting here on the beach, I can just stare at the water and not be involved in these things, right? But then you feel like an obligation, like, hey, I need to be standing up for some of these things that are going on, because they don't make sense. When you look at things, you're like, well, I don't even know how no one says no anymore to these. I'm going to recommend a show for you to watch on Netflix. Believe it or not, it's very good. It speaks so much truth. It's called Armageddon by Ricky Gervais, and he speaks to all
the
Ricky Gervais, who hosted
the EMP attack, or is
Armageddon is just a comedy routine by Ricky Gervais, but he addresses cultural pop culture and what's happening, right? But all these things just don't make sense when you think about and we'll start ending with this, but these campus protests who are celebrating Hamas, and the fact that if they were doing that in Gaza, they would be killed. You know what I mean? If they were these people that are defending, that would in the same way defend all the alphabet soup, they would be killed. You know what I mean? It's just, I can't wrap my head around it. It's just, they've been indoctrinated into the wrong way of thinking. I can't blame them, right? I blame the parents and the educational institutes. But anyways, hey, let's start to wrap down. I'm going to give you final thoughts. And I appreciate your time on this. It's very important. These officers in the law enforcement community are still close to our hearts and close to our friends and family. And we have an invested interest in them even to this day. And so thank you for coming on and discussing this issue, which is very important.
If you have a family member that is in law enforcement, just assume that they go through these injuries every day. If you are a policymaker overseeing a law enforcement department, assume that the injury is there and do something. Don't assume that they can just power on and live their life without any side effects. And just by taking an interest, asking questions, you probably will help somebody.
Very good. Thank you, Chief. And I will put all your links in the description on the YouTube channel and also on the podcast platforms. And this is often copied, pasted, and not really written originally, but I will just say it originally in my own words. Hey, you can call me anytime. My email is all over the internet. You can write me. I'll call you back. Hey, I got coffee on. I even have, maybe a glass of whiskey or two. And you can talk to me at any time, night or day, if you just want to, vent about something that you maybe is bothering you or troubling you. And, I've had a couple of people reach out and we've just chatted, and I hope that helped a little bit. You can always do that with me. And Chief, Pat, my good friend, so good, and hang around for the debrief, but I hope this maybe was helpful to somebody that looking in from the outside, or maybe somebody who is in it right now, and they know that our resources are available, they can help them. And please, life is great, and it can be great. The best is yet to come for all of us. So thanks, everybody, and as always, subscribe to the channel and the show. I'm Cliff Yates.